Behaviorism is an approach to psychology that focuses on an individual's behavior. It combines elements of philosophy, methodology, and psychological theory. It emerged in the early 20th century as a reaction to depth psychology and other more traditional forms of psychology, which often had difficulty making predictions that could be tested using rigorous experimental methods. The primary tenet of methodological behaviorism, as expressed in the writings of John B. Watson and others, is that psychology should have only concerned itself with observable events. Behaviorist philosophies shifted somewhat during the 1940s and 1950s and again since the 1980s. Radical behaviorism is a conceptual variant purposed by B.F. Skinner that acknowledges the presence of private events, including cognition and emotions, and suggests that they are subject to the same controlling variables as are observable behaviors. From early psychology in the 19th century, the behaviorist school of thought ran concurrently and shared commonalities with the psychoanalytic and Gestalt movements in psychology into the 20th century, but also differed from the mental philosophy of the Gestalt psychologists in critical ways. Its main influences were Ivan Pavlov, who investigated classical conditioning, which depends on stimulus procedures to establish reflexes and respondent behaviors, Edward Thorndike, and John B. Watson, who rejected introspective methods and sought to restrict psychology to observable behaviors, and B.F. Skinner, who conducted research on operant conditioning and emphasized observing private events. In the second half of the 20th century, behaviorism was largely eclipsed as a result of the cognitive revolution. During this time, cognitive behavioral therapy evolved. This procedure has demonstrable utility in treating certain pathologies, such as simple phobias, PTSD, and addiction. The application of radical behaviorism, known as applied behavior analysis, is used in a variety of settings, including, for example, organizational behavior management, fostering diet and fitness, and the treatment of such mental disorders as autism and substance abuse. In addition, while behaviorism and cognitive schools of psychological thought may not agree theoretically, they have complemented each other in practical therapeutic applications, such as in clinical behavior analysis versions. There is no universally agreed upon classification, but some titles given to the various branches of behaviorism include methodological. Watson's behaviorism states that only public events can be objectively observed, and that therefore private events should be ignored. Radical. Skinner's behaviorism expands behavioral principles to processes within the organism. It acknowledges the presence of private events such as thoughts and feelings, and suggests that environmental variables control these internal events just as they control observable behaviors. Willard Van Orman-Quine used many of radical behaviorism's ideas in his study of knowledge and language. Teleological. Post-Skinnerian purpose of close to microeconomics focuses on objective observation as opposed to cognitive processes. Theoretical. Post-Skinnerian accepts observable internal states, dynamic, but eclectic in choice of theoretical structures, emphasizes parsimony. Biological. Post-Skinnerian, centered on perceptual and motor modules of behavior, theory of behavior systems. Psychological behaviorism. Arthur W. Stayatz. First, general behaviorism that centers on human behavior. Created time-out, token reinforcement and other methods, analyses, findings and the theory of that helped form behavioral child development, education, abnormal, and clinical areas, also terming this behavioral analysis in 1963. PB laid the basis for cognitive behavior therapy, provides basic theory and research that unifies emotional and behavioral conditioning, and introduces new avenues for basic and applied behavior analysis. Two subtypes are Hurlian and post-Hurlian. theoretical, group data, not dynamic, physiological, purposive. Tolman's behavioristic anticipation of cognitive psychology. Definition according to B.F. Skinner, behaviorism is the philosophy behind the science of behavior. Skinner was influential in defining radical behaviorism, a philosophy codifying the basis of his school of research, while EAB differs from other approaches to behavioral research on numerous methodological and theoretical points. Radical behaviorism departs from methodological behaviorism most notably in accepting feelings, states of mind and introspection as existent and scientifically treatable. This is done by characterizing them as something non-dualistic, and here, Skinner takes a divide-and-conquer approach, with some instances being identified with bodily conditions or behavior, and others getting a more extended analysis in terms of behavior. However, radical behaviorism stops short of identifying feelings as causes of sexual behavior. Among other points of difference were a rejection of the reflex as a model of all behavior and a defense of a science of behavior complementary to, but independent of physiology. Radical behaviorism has considerable overlap with other Western philosophical positions such as American pragmatism. Another way of looking at behaviorism is through the lens of egoism, which is defined as being a causal analysis of the elements that define human behavior with a strong social component involved. Experimental and conceptual innovations. This essentially philosophical position gained strength from the success of Skinner's early experimental work with rats and pigeons. Summarized in his books The Behavior of Organisms and Schedules of Reinforcement. Of particular importance was his concept of the operant response, of which the canonical example was the rat's lever press, in contrast with the idea of a physiological or reflex response. An operant is a class of structurally distinct but functionally equivalent responses. For example, while a rat might press a lever with its left paw or its right paw or its tail, all of these responses operate on the world in the same way and have a common consequence. Operants are often thought of as species of responses, where the individuals differ, but the class coheres in its function shared consequences with operants and reproductive success with species. This is a clear distinction between Skinner's theory and SR theory. Skinner's empirical work expanded on earlier research on trial and error learning by researchers such as Thorndike and Guthrie, with both conceptual reformulations. Thorndike's notion of a stimulus-response association or connection was abandoned, and methodological ones, the use of the free operant, so called because the animal was now permitted to respond at its own rate rather than in a series of trials determined by the experimenter. Procedures. With this method, Skinner carried out substantial experimental work on the effects of different schedules and rates of reinforcement on the rates of operant responses made by rats and pigeons. He achieved remarkable success in training animals to perform unexpected responses, to emit large numbers of responses, and to demonstrate many empirical regularities at the purely behavioral level. This lent some credibility to his conceptual analysis. It is largely his conceptual analysis that made his work much more rigorous than his peers, a point which can be seen clearly in his seminal work of Theories of Learning Necessary, in which he criticizes what he viewed to be theoretical weaknesses then common in the study of psychology. An important descendant of the experimental analysis of behavior is the Society for Quantitative Analysis of Behavior. Relation to language. As Skinner turned from experimental work to concentrate on the philosophical underpinnings of a science of behavior, his attention turned to human language with Verbal Behavior and other language-related publications. Verbal behavior laid out a vocabulary and theory for functional analysis of verbal behavior, and was strongly criticized in a review by Noam Chomsky. Skinner did not respond in detail but claimed that Chomsky failed to understand his ideas, and the disagreements between the two and the theories involved have been further discussed. innateness theory is opposed to behaviorist theory, which claims that language is a set of habits that can be acquired by means of conditioning. According to some, this process that the behaviorists define is a very slow and gentle process to explain a phenomenon as complicated as language learning. What was important for a behaviorist's analysis of human behavior was not language acquisition so much as the interaction between language and overt behavior. In an essay republished in his 1969 book, Contingencies of Reinforcement, Skinner took the view that humans could construct linguistic stimuli that would then acquire control over their behavior in the same way that external stimuli could. The possibility of such instructional control over behavior meant that contingencies of reinforcement would not always produce the same effects on human behavior as they reliably do in other animals. The focus of a radical behaviorist analysis of human behavior therefore shifted to an attempt to understand the interaction between instructional control and contingency control, and also to understand the behavioral processes that determine what instructions are constructed and what control they acquire over behavior. Recently, a new line of behavioral research on language was started under the name of relational frame theory. Education. Behaviorism focuses on one particular view of learning, a change in external behavior achieved through using reinforcement and repetition to shape behavior. Skinner found that behaviors could be shaped when the use of rewards was implemented. Desired behavior is rewarded, while the undesired behavior is punished. Incorporating behaviorism into the classroom allowed educators to assist their students in excelling both academically and personally. In the field of language learning, this type of teaching was called the audio-lingual method, characterized by the whole class using choral chanting of key phrases, dialogues and immediate correction. Within the behaviorist view of learning, the teacher is the dominant person in the classroom and takes complete control. Evaluation of learning comes from the teacher, who decides what is right or wrong. The learner does not have any opportunity for evaluation or reflection within the learning process, they are simply told what is right or wrong. The conceptualization of learning using this approach could be considered superficial, as the focus is on external changes in behavior, i.e., not interested in the internal processes of learning leading to behavior change, and has no place for the emotions involved in the process. Whether this approach is right or wrong, it cannot be denied that an aspect of memorization is regarded by key scholars as critical in any language learning: operant conditioning. Operant conditioning was developed by B.F. Skinner in 1937 and deals with the modification of voluntary behavior, or operant behavior. Operant behavior operates on the environment and is maintained by its consequences. Reinforcement and punishment, the core tools of operant conditioning, are either positive or negative. Skinner created the Skinner box or operant conditioning chamber to test the effects of operant conditioning principles on rats. From this study, he discovered that the rats learned very effectively if they were rewarded frequently. Skinner also found that he could shape the rat's behavior through the use of rewards, which could, in turn, be applied to human learning as well. Classical conditioning. Although operant conditioning plays the largest role in discussions of behavioral mechanisms, classical conditioning is also an important behavior analytic process that need not refer to mental or other internal processes. Pavlov's experiments with dogs provide the most familiar example of the classical conditioning procedure. In simple conditioning, the dog was presented with a stimulus such as a light or a sound, and then food was placed in the dog's mouth. After a few repetitions of this sequence, the light or sound by itself caused the dog to salivate. Although Pavlov proposed some tentative physiological processes that might be involved in classical conditioning, these have not been confirmed. The idea of classical conditioning helped behaviorist John Watson discover the key mechanism behind how humans acquire the behaviors that they do, which was to find a natural reflex that produces the response being considered. Molar versus molecular behaviorism. Skinner's view of behavior is most often characterized as a molecular view of behavior, that is, behavior can be decomposed into atomistic parts or molecules. This view is inconsistent with Skinner's complete description of behavior as delineated in other works, including his 1981 article, Selection by Consequences. Skinner proposed that a complete account of behavior requires understanding of selection history at three levels: biology, behavior, and for some species, culture. This whole organism then interacts with its environment. Molecular behaviorists use notions from amelioration theory, negative power function discounting, or additive versions of negative power function discounting. Molar behaviorists, such as Howard Rachlin, Richard Hunstein, and William Baum, argue that behavior cannot be understood by focusing on events in the moment. That is, they argue that behavior is best understood as the ultimate product of an organism's history, and that molecular behaviorists are committing a fallacy by inventing fictitious proximal causes for behavior. Molar behaviorists argue that standard molecular constructs, such as associative strength, are better replaced by molar variables such as rate of reinforcement. Thus, a molar behaviorist would describe loving someone as a pattern of loving behavior over time. There is no isolated, proximal cause of loving behavior, only a history of behaviors that can be summarized as love. In philosophy, behaviorism is a psychological movement that can be contrasted with philosophy of mind. The basic premise of radical behaviorism is that the study of behavior should be a natural science, such as chemistry or physics, without any reference to hypothetical inner states of organisms as causes for their behavior. Less radical varieties are unconcerned with philosophical positions on internal, mental and subjective experience. Behaviorism takes a functional view of behavior. According to Edmund Fantino and colleagues, behavior analysis has much to offer the study of phenomena normally dominated by cognitive and social psychologists. We hope that successful application of behavioral theory and methodology will not only shed light on central problems in judgment and choice, but will also generate greater appreciation of the behavioral approach. Behaviorist sentiments are not uncommon within philosophy of language and analytic philosophy. It is sometimes argued that Ludwig Wittgenstein defended a behaviorist position, but while there are important relations between his thought and behaviorism, the claim that he was a behaviorist is quite controversial. Mathematician Alan Turing is also sometimes considered a behaviorist, but he himself did not make this identification. In logical and empirical positivism, the meaning of psychological statements are their verification conditions, which consist of performed overt behavior. W.V. Quine made use of a type of behaviorism, influenced by some of Skinner's ideas, in his own work on language. Gilbert Ryle defended a distinct strain of philosophical behaviorism, sketched in his book The Concept of Mind. Ryle's central claim was that instances of dualism frequently represented category mistakes, and hence that they were really misunderstandings of the use of ordinary language. Daniel Dennett likewise acknowledges himself to be a type of behaviorist, though he offers extensive criticism of radical behaviorism and refutes Skinner's rejection of the value of intentional idioms and the possibility of free will. This is Dennett's main point in Skinner Skinned. Dennett argues that there is a crucial difference between explaining and explaining away. If our explanation of apparently rational behavior turns out to be extremely simple, we may want to say that the behavior was not really rational after all. But if the explanation is very complex and intricate, we may want to say not that the behavior is not rational, but that we now have a better understanding of what rationality consists in. Curtis Brown, Philosophy of Mind, Behaviorism.